of how one could, or if one could, create a costume that approximates what's seen in the film. Another thing then, and this is where I kind of come in more, is in the aspect of the comparative anatomy. A lot of criticism has been drawn about various creases and folds and dimples and so forth, which some have argued are not anatomically reasonable, and therefore are artifacts of the costume. And one hypothesis to explain this apparent line right here was that the costume had a pair of trousers. Whoop, I'm going to zap somebody right in the eyes with that. A pair of trousers, and then the body part was kind of like those little sleepers you get for the kids that come down between the legs and snap underneath there. And that left then a seam that wasn't completely obscured by the hair. Well, his argument was that it just depends on what you consider normal human anatomy. If your image of a model is an airbrushed, liposucked, artificially enhanced figure, then maybe not. But if you go to a site like a website of a naturist colony, where you have people of all ages and all physiques that are uninhibited in allowing their anatomy to be photographed, it was a very simple exercise to identify quite a number of examples that resemble and reflect the very features that supposedly were unanatomical. And then I also culled lots of images from comparative anatomy of primates to do that as well. So for example, on Patty, you can see these hanging folds underneath her shoulder blade that we older folks start to get as the elasticity of the skin is lessened and the adipose tissue percentage increases. Those would be very difficult to introduce into a costume. Most folds that have any resemblance to that are not bilaterally symmetrical. A fold would go at an angle all the way across the bag. In order to get that bilateral symmetry, you would have to actually tailor them into the costume. And so, for example, there was one picture of the back of a big male gorilla in a zoo who had a little extra subcutaneous adipose, and the appearance of the folds under the shoulder blades were identical to what you saw on Patty, who presumably is fattening up a little bit here in late August, getting ready for the oncoming winter. We have evidence from authoritative sources. It's not just your average Joe or Jane out in the woods, but some of these incidents have been documented by people in positions of authority while on active duty. So for example, back in Skamania County in southern Washington, a county that has some notoriety for being one of the first to pass an ordinance protecting Sasquatch, Deputy Sheriff Bill Klosner, who still lives in that area. I talked to his wife when I was speaking at the county library one time. He unfortunately was out of town. He cast a very remarkable, very clear footprint. Then a very famous one, Dennis Hereford, the Hereford Track from Grays Harbor County in western Washington over against just up beneath the Olympic Peninsula. Investigated a scene with some remarkable footprints. The conditions were really amazing. Hard pan logging spur road with a thick layer of pulverized dust that had just been wet down by a rain. So when it walked through there, you could see that the mud has extruded up around the foot and up between the toes, and creating this remarkably clear impression of the foot. So clear, in fact, that there are remarkable anatomical details. The head and the base of the fifth metatarsal, a little swollen, perhaps a little arthritic, or gout even, or something. And then there's another bulge right here. That bulge is in your own foot. If you look at a wet print on cement after coming out of the swimming pool, that corresponds to the calcaneocuboid joint. That's one of the joints which, together with the talonavicular, forms the transverse tarsal joint, the point at which this mid-tarsal break occurs. Now, what was really interesting is the incident also preserved some half tracks, some incomplete tracks. Actually, they're complete, but it's just only showing the fore part of the foot. This break is a result of kind of the attenuation, the thinning of the plaster there. But what's really fascinating is if you take this track and superimpose it with this one, where I've independently inferred the skeletal proportions, you find that, lo and behold, that half track terminates just in front of the transverse tarsal joint. What's even more interesting to me, and I didn't notice this until much more recently as I was kind of looking at this, you can just see the darker kind of halo of that half track with weight. Now the half track occurs in this case when it's running. With our longitudinal arch, our foot can poise up on just the ball of the foot, on this row of joints. But without an arch to support the weight over the ball, the foot collapses into flexion at that next joint, which is the transverse tarsal joint, that next flexible joint, that is. And so when you so in this case, it was running, but it runs up on the front half of the foot. But when you're running, obviously, you're magnifying the, through acceleration and deceleration, the impact on the substrate, on the soil, and the forces that are taken up on the sole pad, and more weight over a smaller area. So it has to displace more to absorb that energy. And lo and behold, that half track, it flares out, to the point actually that it obscures these two bulges here, with the expansion, lateral expansion and forward expansion of that sole pad. Again, what are the chances, and obviously I'm speaking to the choir, I don't have to convince you that this is legitimate, but what are the chances of some hoaxer incorporating all of those subtle details, incorporating subtle landmarks that are quite consistently indicative of bony features that are consistent across example after example after example of these footprints. This gentleman wishes to remain anonymous. He was in law enforcement, in wildlife law enforcement in Florida for 30 years before retiring. And now he's a snowbird and spends his summers in Wyoming riding an ATV with his wife, two ATVs. They ride ATVs in the backcountry, patrolling for the Forest Service. He was called in to examine an unusual set of tracks. This 16-inch footed creature had come down out of the woods into the area of a little cluster of a half dozen or so seasonally occupied cabins, and at night, and it had come right up apparently to kitchen windows where people were inside having supper, obviously attracted, curious about the sights and smells and sounds. You could see where when it came up to the windows, it had actually crouched. And as it crouched, its heels came up and it rocked forward, and there was differential pressure under the forepart of the foot. There's good examples of a degree of pronation and supination, the kind of twisting at the mid-tarsal joint. Supination is when the inside edge is kind of raised and elevated a bit, and that makes the foot kind of curved with more concavity on the inside edge of the foot. When the foot's pronated, the inside edge is flattened out completely, and the long axis of the foot is more directly aligned with the forefoot and the hind foot. So lots of signs of animation. Anyway, my first experience with tracks was in 1996 in the foothills of the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla. You can see the alternating steps here. I'm going to kind of hustle through this a little bit. I was impressed with these because of the clarity. This one is really dramatic. You can see there's an extrusion artifact as a result of the mid-tarsal break. The heel's back here, the forefoot now with weight concentrated over the forefoot, the mud extruded back here. Here the flash is highlighted, a rise like a speed bump right here in the mid part of the foot that's remarkably similar to examples from elsewhere, such as the Patterson-Gimlin film. There were also examples of half tracks associated with these footprints. So here it had taken off, it was running. I think a car had spooked it coming down from the mountains real early on a Sunday morning, late Saturday night, effectively. And so this is the model of how they would run. So the foot is flexing here, the entire forefoot is making contact. There's an extrusion wall, a ridge right here of mud pushed back. It slid quite some distance in the mud before the toes tightly flexed. So in some tracks, the toes are passively extended, hardly making an imprint. In fact, There are some that look like three-toed tracks because the fourth and fifth have hardly touched the soil, just made a slight impression. But then when it has to use the toes for prehension, then they flex tightly and they clearly leave their imprints in that mud. Example of the half track alongside a full-length track, toes clearly visible there. And resembling this in that mid-tarsal pressure ridge, this track that was photographed by Lyle Laverty, a timber cruiser for the U.S. Forest Service, another agency personnel, at the Patterson-Gimlin film site. It was subsequently cast by Bob Titmus along with 9 other tracks, and preserves very nicely that pressure ridge where the material has been, as the material is compressed here, you can see how it's deepest right in there. As it is compressed, it pushes the material back and expands. And that's where these expansion cracks come into play because the foot isn't holding that substrate down. So now you've got to visualize this is a dynamic record of the entire step. Its foot isn't held like this as it steps into the ground. Its foot doesn't go over as it rocks over. It's very flat-footed, and it initially makes a very flat impression, like the casts that Roger held up. He looked for the flattest, clearest, undisturbed examples of a right and left. Unfortunately, they had too much resemblance to that carved wooden foot, flat, board-like artifice that Wallace made. It was these kind of tracks that really makes the case. But then, so at first it makes that flat impression, but then as the heel comes up, let's see here, hold on a second. Let me go one more. Maybe one more, there we go. As the heel comes up, weight's concentrated over this part of the foot flexes across the transverse tarsal joint. That concentrated pressure under the front part of the foot causes material to expand back up into, because of the forward impulse, it expands backward. Now we do that sometimes. We'll leave a ridge like that or a disc displaced behind the ball of the foot or behind the big toes, because we use our toes for much more for propulsion, especially the big toe, than they do. They use the toes more for prehension, for gripping, for grasping. Let me jump back now here. So here's what's interesting. Here's one of the casts that Patterson made. It's excellent. It was extremely fresh. That substrate was not a granitic sand like you would find in a sandbox. It was an eroded shale, and the grains were very angular. And so when that imprint was made, those grains kind of locked together. That's why the tracks could be seen literally months later, even despite rainstorms, still preserved, still held in place. Well, the clarity of this, you can see the toe stems really clearly, the pads of the toes. You can see the outline of the foot very clearly, the bulge here that corresponds to the navicular tuberosity, and on down around. Anyway, again, allowed me to infer the approximate positions of key elements of the foot, places of joints. There's a slight indentation right there. That is similar to the flexion crease across your palm, so that which is opposite your knuckles. And so the sole pad extends a bit further up past those joints to slightly web the toes, just like your fingers are slightly webbed. Well, and then if you take that skeleton and superimpose it over the Titmus cast that shows the pressure ridge, well, again, once more, the inference of this joint position based on these landmarks independently corresponds to the position of that transverse tarsal pressure ridge as a result of the more dynamic footprint cast. Now the basis of that is simply a heritage from a primate foot that's adapted for grasp climbing, we call it, going up vertical supports using a big, powerful big toe or hallux that pinches against the substrate with the other 4 toes opposite. And so the front half of the foot is prehensile. It has to hold on, but you still have to use the foot as a lever. And so the greater range of mobility found in the midfoot allows the heel to act as that lever. It allows it to move. Okay? And so that's the basis for this. So this reconstruction is based on that Titmus footprint. So this is the, actually I probably should invert that image so that it corresponds better to the surface of the track as you would see it. It's a positive rather than a negative. So the main difference, basically, there's one more point there. The main difference is, the characteristic feature of the human foot is the longitudinal arch. Our foot, we've given up some of that mobility because we don't use our toes for prehension. Except for, if you've ever seen films or documentaries of individuals who've been born without upper limbs, for example, and they develop a tremendous amount of dexterity and manipulability with their toes, can dress themselves, can peel a banana, can eat, can do all sorts of activities through practice. But most of us, our foot is adapted to be a fairly rigid platform. The toes are kind of vestigial. They give some traction, but when we wear shoes, that doesn't provide much function as it is. And so that stiff platform is enhanced by the presence of a longitudinal arch. The Sasquatch foot, on the other hand, can be seen as an extension of the adaptation seen in great apes along a continuum of greater body size and greater terrestriality, greater degrees of living on the ground. So here's a chimpanzee with a fairly narrow, short heel, a very divergent, very long, robust big toe, and very long lateral toes. Here's a lowland gorilla we see with increased body mass. The heel is longer, give a little more leverage. It's broader because of the increased body weight. It's not spending so much time in the trees, and so its big toe, thumb-like big toe, isn't as big, and the lateral toes have gotten shorter. If they're shorter, they resist bending stresses better than long curved toes do. Mountain gorilla, even larger, more time on the ground. Longer, broader heel, less divergent big toe, shorter lateral toes. The Sasquatch simply takes that a couple of notches further up. So really long heel, very broad heel. You can, if you take heel breadth to length ratios, plot those against human values, Sasquatch are completely separate, completely no overlap whatsoever in the proportions. Shorter big toe, less divergence, shorter lateral toes, but still much longer than ours relative. All right, we're gonna run out of time here, jump a little bit ahead. I do most of my field work with John Mindzinski when we're in the field. This is the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Pocatello is right over here, just off the map, just a touch. This is the Idaho-Montana border, this red line here. The Wind River Range comes off down from the greater Yellowstone area. It's an amazing area. It has the most glaciers in the lower 48. About 3/4 of the mountain range is wilderness area, roadless wilderness area. The Wind River Indian Reservation is one of the largest Indian reservations. It takes up about 1/3 of the mountain range itself here and extends far off over to here. And and the mountain areas are very restricted access. Even the natives rarely go up there, except for ceremonies or burials. They live down on the flats. So it's extremely remote. Amazing. John lives in Lander, or just south of Lander, in Atlantic City in the Rocky Mountains. That's because the water that falls on this side of the range ends up flowing towards the Atlantic. So on that side of the continental divide. But he's done a lot to document the history of that region, and we've made lots of efforts to create networks with agency personnel. I've done presentations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Wyoming Game and Fish departments. Right here is Palisades Reservoir, just before you make the turn to go up to the Tetons right here. Phil said he visited. It's a beautiful place. And the reservoir was drawn down, and someone had noticed footprints. Luckily, we were able to just go right down. In this case, I was working with Brandon Tennant. Some of you may know Brandon. He owns Sasquatch Prints, and some of the T-shirts you see me depicted in pictures are his designs. But there were these very large footprints, big 17-inch footprints, still preserved. We were about 10 days late getting there. It had rained a couple of times, and some of the tracks had been driven over, but we counted over 45 footprints stretching along this line. Really quite interesting. Here we made 6 casts and photographed everything obviously, and mapped out the trackway. There's a couple of red flags. I mean, some of the edges are kind of sharp. Some of the surfaces are a little bit flat. Some of that has to do with the substrate a little bit. There's some human tracks